Hello everyone and welcome to April's Career Advice Series webinar, Finding Long-Term Career Satisfaction Through Career Fit. The Career Advice Series is produced by ABA Legal Career Central, created to serve as a predominant reservoir of information and inspiration for pre-law, law students, and lawyers everywhere, dispensing advice through publications, postings, and programming. We're very pleased to have Dr. Larry Richard with us today. Dr. Richard is the founder of Lawyer Brain, LLC, and is an acclaimed author and speaker, focusing on the use of positive psychology in building lawyer resilience, emotional intelligence, accountability, and productivity. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Richard to start things off. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, everybody. Today, we're going to be talking about the following things. I'm basically going to be introducing a career model and talking about how you can use that model to make a better, more accurate plan about what you want to do with your career, whether it's in law or in other places that use your legal skills or background. So the first thing we'll talk about is a model that I developed a number of years ago when I had a career counseling practice, and I call it an inner-directed approach. Then we'll spend most of the time on that model. And we'll talk at the beginning just to set the table, so to speak, with some information about the lawyer personality. I've spent 20 plus years studying lawyers' personalities, and I've come to the conclusion that our personality traits are a major, major factor in most of the decisions that we make, personal and professional, for the main reason that there is a very specific kind of person that goes into law, and that specific kind of person has traits that are atypical and strong. And that's why personality is a major factor that cannot be ignored. And then we'll finish after talking about the model with a couple of tips. So let's start with the inner-directed approach. And the first way to do that is to talk about why we generally get it wrong. Most lawyers approach the career planning process by looking at what's out there in the marketplace. The question, what's out there, is a natural question. I've asked it myself. And you know, when you're looking for a job, whether it's your first job or you're trying to make a transition, whether you want to stay in law and just get a different position, or you want to ask the question, is there something else I can be doing? It's very tempting to say, well, I wonder what's out there. The problem with that is twofold. First of all, it misses the most important question you should be asking, which is first, ask what's in there, what's inside, what is your career identity, and that, the clarity about who you are and what gives you deep, long-term satisfaction should really guide the second question, what's out there. And secondly, when you look at, quote, existing jobs, most jobs are created because an organization decides that they need some personnel, and they don't really know what kind of person exactly will be perfect. But to advertise a job, they're forced to pick particular criteria. So they are in favor of a cautious approach usually. And that means that you might be perfectly suited. In fact, you might be ideal for the job, but not fit the posted criteria. And it's much better to obtain jobs by networking, and networking in turn is fueled by having a clear idea of what you want. So it all goes back to who are you and what do you want? Now, when you use this inner-directed approach, sometimes you find that the thing that is making you look for a job, maybe dissatisfaction or a desire for something that you aren't currently achieving, you realize it's a much narrower element than you originally thought. I've had people, when I was doing career counseling, that were ready to scrap their entire career as a lawyer and go into something else unknown, when all they really needed was to change to an environment that gave them more autonomy or played to their strengths better or was a more of a people environment or whatever. Sometimes a minor change can have a big impact, so it's really helpful to know What criteria drive you? Also, when you get to the networking point, when you get to the point of your career search where you figured out what you want, you're starting to look for it, the best approach is networking, where you talk to as many people as you can that you know and tell them what you're looking for, and you interview people to find out possibilities before they turn into posted jobs. At that stage, the more clarity you have about what you want, the more memorable it will be to your friends and colleagues when you tell them that you're interested in their keeping you in mind. So clarity from inside communicates much more clearly and memorably to other people, and likewise to potential employers in the interview. And then it's more likely to produce satisfaction. The overall finding, sounds very commonsensical, but it's good to have the confidence that comes from knowing that empirical science has confirmed this. And this I'm talking about is satisfaction in a career is mainly a function of the congruence, the fit between who you are, your internal career identity, and the job and the characteristics surrounding the job that you're doing. It's not just what kind of work you're doing, but elements of that work as well. I'll explain that in more detail later on. So the fit is what really determines the satisfaction. Let's look at the personality factors. I'm going to show you some data on what I call the normal lawyer personality. Normal is a statistical term here. We're not getting into any judgments. So as I mentioned earlier, lawyers' personalities are more intense than the general public. They're outliers. They're the people who go into law are not like other people, and there's a reason for that. And sometimes people who are like the general public go into law and they drop out at a measurably higher rate than the typical lawyer personality folks do. And that further concentrates this unique lawyer personality in the profession. The traits that are characteristic of our breed help us to be more effective as lawyers. But there's a downside, because the very things that make us good as lawyers often make us less effective in some of the more demanding non-lawyer roles that we increasingly are being asked to play these days. And almost all of these other roles are roles that require people skills. So leader, manager, supervisor, mentor, rainmaker, those all differ from the role of lawyer in that they place a much greater premium on interpersonal and intrapersonal skills, emotional intelligence, listening skills, the ability to be self-aware, etc. So let's take a look at some of the data that I've gathered over the last 30 years. Most of this data that I'm going to show you today comes from one particular test called the Caliper Profile. Caliper's been around since 1964. It is widely used. It was originally developed as a tool for selecting people in a business context. Now it's used for development and leadership feedback and all kinds of other things. But the basic idea is that what you are trying to look at with a personality profile is stable trait information. People vary in lots of different ways, but what makes us unique is that we have very stable styles of thinking and feeling. And that stability, those stable styles are called personalities. So Caliper has tested over the last 52 years, at this point, close to 6 million people, mostly college educated and above, including some very high-performing executives, professionals, etc. Over the last 22 years, I've tested about 5,000 lawyers myself, including a lot of leaders. And here is what we find. There are 18 Caliper traits. It is typical on each of those traits for large numbers of people to have their high and low scores cancel out in the aggregate. And so the average for each trait comes in around 50% on a 0 to 100% scale. So every trait you'd expect to be close to 50. Sometimes it might be in the 40s, sometimes it might be in the 50s. It would be unusual if an occupation had one of the 18 traits, or even two of the 18 traits, below 40 or above 60. That would be a very unusual event. Lawyers have 6 of their 18 traits in those low or high ranges, what are called standard deviations. So we are 1 to 2 standard deviations below or above the norm on 6 of the 18 traits. Let's look at those traits. Here's a percentile scale. You can see that the mid-range for any trait is 50%. Most traits average for any group between 40 and 60. And yet 6 of the lawyer traits are in the area below the dark orange or above the dark orange. What are those traits? The first one is skepticism. This is the hallmark trait for lawyers. It's what we do. The nature of practicing law requires us to ask questions that scrutinize information, that challenge assertions that people make, that don't take anything for granted, that ask if there's some mischief afoot, if there's some hidden agenda, if there's something that we should not believe about somebody's statement. And that job can be done by an average person, but it's much easier if the person doing that job happens to come to the task with a personality trait like skepticism, because it matches up with the task. It means that skeptical people are now doing skeptical work. And so the legal profession attracts highly skeptical individuals, averaging in the 90th percentile compared to only 50% for the public. That's important to understand, because when you're looking for a career, your own skepticism will affect your judgments about what works and what doesn't work. It'll even affect how readily you accept what I'm telling you today. And most skeptics don't realize when they're being skeptical that they're being skeptical. The next trait is autonomy. Lawyers really, really like to do things on their own. They don't like being micromanaged, being told what to do. They like being autonomous. And that's all well and good, but it can have a downside when you're looking for a career, because the highly autonomous person may buck the system. They may not do things in the established way. And sometimes when you're looking for careers, doing things in an established way is done because it has worked over many years. And so many of my clients have gone on, to use a tort term, frolics and detours just because of their autonomy needs, and gotten themselves a little bit off track in searching for careers. The next one is urgency. This is actually a useful trait for lawyers because clients want us to be responsive, and so people who are impatient are drawn with greater frequency to the legal profession than to other occupations. And it's a perfect fit. I mean, when clients want things done yesterday, the urgent person is dispositionally inclined to give that client immediate responses as much as possible. Urgency, however, is a two-edged sword, and when you're trying to plan your career, there is some detail work, some legwork, some research. There are some aspects to the job search process that can take some time and require some patience, and the high urgent person wants to have it done immediately and may be looking for shortcuts that cut against their own self-interest. The next trait is sociability. Lawyers are very low on this trait. What it has to do with is how inclined we are to pay attention to relationships, to initiating authentic, intimate, vulnerable, emotional relationships. Lawyers generally hear all of those words that I just mentioned as touchy-feely, and by that I mean off-putting. Turns out that research shows increasingly that relationships are vital to human survival, success, and satisfaction. And the fact that we're low on sociability doesn't mean we don't need relationships. It just means that we're awkward and uncomfortable around them. The process of getting the job you want ultimately requires networking, and networking is much easier to do when you are at least willing to connect with people, especially people you may not know. So you may need to enter into your discomfort zone. If you're a typical lawyer, you're going to be below the average on this trait, and that means there'll be some discomfort. My general rule in job search is discomfort is a good sign. It's a sign that you're making progress. I mean, within reason. So you need to be willing to experience a bit of discomfort in order to make progress. The next trait is abstract reasoning. Lawyers love problem solving and analyzing. This is generally an asset in the job search process, unless you overdo it. Too much of a good thing gets you into analysis paralysis. The last trait is the most important one, and that's called resilience. Resilience has to do with how thick or thin-skinned you are in the face of criticism or rejection or setbacks, and also how well you bounce back. So basically, what resilience is about is when you get rejected, let's say. And in a job search, there are many opportunities for rejection. The low resilience person can have a very strong negative reaction to that kind of rejection. What that might look like is, well, I don't really want to go and reach out to strangers anymore, or I'm only going to look at jobs that make me comfortable. Low resilience people tend to resist being in their discomfort zone. They don't like criticism. They don't like when they don't get included in meetings. And so the key here is not just that we're 20% below the public, but look at that note under the word resilience. 90% of lawyers score below the 50th percentile. That means 9 out of 10 lawyers are in the bottom half of this trait. We are a very thin-skinned occupational group. This is luckily a trait that can be improved through practice. And there is a book called The Resilience Factor. I'll mention that again, The Resilience Factor. The lead author is Karen Reivich, R-E-I-V-I-C-H. That's R-E-I-V-I-C-H, Karen Reivich, The Resilience Factor. And this book is really a self-help book with very good science about how you can build your resilience through a series of cognitive strategies. I recommend it, and I recommend that you pay attention to it, because resilience can really knock us out of the success box when we're looking for careers. Now we have a question from a participant. What if I know what it is that I'm looking for and I'm telling my connections what it is that I'm looking for, but it seems that I need a certain set of skills for that position and I can't get those skills until somebody gives me a chance? Then what? So we're actually going to get to that at the very end of the seminar. I'll just give you a quick tip now, which is sometimes clarifying the internal criteria, as I'm going to be talking about, doesn't change the fact that you may need those skills, but it gives you a deeper, richer confidence when you're talking to people that increase the likelihood that they will take a chance on you. It's a very subtle, intangible thing, but it makes a big difference, and I've seen this dozens and dozens of times. The other thing is that you can consider volunteering for jobs that teach you some of those skills. Volunteer positions are a great way to get skills that you don't previously have, and then the third way to do it is through mentoring. So we'll come back to that at the end of the seminar. Resilience graphically looks like this. The midpoint, if you look at the word E, the third E in the word resilience, that's the point. And the red arrow is showing the average for lawyers. So the second arrow is the average for the public. We're way down at the bottom. Now, let's move on. So we're going to talk now about the model. There are three phases that I'll discuss here. The first one is how to discover your career identity, and that's going to be 80 to 85% of what I cover. And then the other 15% is about developing your job criteria and then directing your attention to the job search. So here's the model laid out. On the left is you. This is your career identity on the left. And on the right is the job. And what we're looking at is the fit between you and the job. And I break the career identity down into 5 components, each of which can be researched. You can introspect to find it out. You can take tests. You can do self-help activities. I have a book that you can find in just about any law school career guidance office and it's called The New What Can You Do with a Law Degree, with my co-author Tanya Hansen. And in there, we lay out a model, this model, and tell you the different self-help steps that you can take to figure out these components. Once we're done with the left side, we'll go into the right side and talk about the job itself. But right now, let's concentrate on the left side. So the first and most important component of your career identity is your values. We'll cover each of these in more detail. Right now, I just want to give you the list. The second component of your identity is your psychological needs. Third, what's your communication style? How do you interact with people? What's your preferred way of doing that? Fourth, what are your motivated skills? What do you do well and you like doing? So it's a two-piece, combined type of criterion. And the last one, what are your career interests? On the right side is the job itself. What line of work do you want to do? Do you want to stay in law? Do you want to be a trial lawyer? Do you want to be an employment lawyer? Do you want to be a corporate lawyer? Or do you want to go into another job? Do you want to be an editor, a teacher, a bus driver? That's the line of work. And that has some correlation to job satisfaction. But what's more important is within any line of work, what are the features of the job? I call that the job environment and conditions. So let's say for example, you wanted to leave law and become an editor, say of a legal publication. That alone is not going to guarantee satisfaction. You might want to further ask questions like, where am I doing this editing? Am I alone at my computer? Am I working for a big company like LexisNexis? Do I have a lot of autonomy, or do I work in a very rigid, structured environment? Am I helping people or making a difference in some way? How much flexibility do I have in my hours? Can I put artwork on my walls, etc.? These things matter differentially. Some people consider those things I just listed important. Others of them will be unimportant. Everybody varies, but you need to know what are the environmental factors for you that make the work matter more or less to you. We'll talk about that more. Every one of these 5 components of your career identity has what I call a diagnostic emotion, when that particular component is being met and when it's out of alignment. There's an emotion for each. So for example, when your values are not met, when you're in a job where it doesn't meet your values or even conflicts with your values, at the very least, if it doesn't meet it, you generally experience disappointment. And when it conflicts actively with a value, you'll experience anger. Psychological needs are a little bit different from values. A value is what's important to a person. A psychological need is something that is important for you to have, but when you have it, it kind of disappears into the background. Values never disappear. They're always with you. But psychological needs, let's take an example, a need for security. When a person has job security, they don't go into work every day thinking, oh, I'm so glad I have tenure or whatever. It just fades away. And it's kind of like, if I can use an analogy to the physical world, we need oxygen. But when we have it, nobody walks around saying, I'm so glad I'm breathing oxygen. It just disappears off of our radar screen as a thing that we think about. When the need is stifled, when you're not getting that need met, the experience emotionally is frustration. Communication style is, what do you like with other people? Do you like being with extroverts or with introverts? Do you like a fast-paced office, or do you like things to be slow and deliberate? What's the style in which you interact with people and with tasks and with information? And when that style is not yours, when you're in a place that doesn't match your style, we often experience confusion or bafflement or puzzlement. What are these people behaving this way for? Why are they like that? It's like, I don't fit in here. Motivated skills, remember I said there are 2 components here. This is a combined criterion. There's both, am I good at a skill, and do I like using the skill? So when you don't get to use a skill that you like, it can feel empty. let's say you have a foreign language that you're fluent in and you like to use that in your work and you never get to do it. It can feel wasted, empty, I'm missing an opportunity. Let's take the opposite. Let's say you're good at something, but you don't really like doing it. You're good at proofreading, but you don't want to spend your life doing that. But you get to do a lot in your job because people recognized how good you are. That can produce tedium. So if you experience either of those, it's a signal that motivated skills are not fitting with your identity. And career interest, what do you like? This is often what self-help books concentrate the most on because it's low-hanging fruit. It's very easy to identify a career interest. It's very easy to make a list of things you like and don't like, but interests are superficial. They change readily. They're not part of a deeply held identity for most people. There's about 10% of the population that studies show interests are part of their identity. But for most of us, interests are fleeting. They can change, and therefore they're not a reliable gauge to make long-term decisions about your career, even though at the time you're considering them, they feel just as permanent as anything else I've mentioned. So it's important to realize that. And this is the duh emotion. When your interests are not aligned, you feel boredom, lack of interest. Now, it's very important when you are thinking about planning your career, changing your career, and getting data about your career identity in particular. When you gather data about your identity, be careful of that urgency. You want to be deliberate and patient, and most of all, gather lots of repetitive data. When I used to do career counseling with individuals, I wouldn't just give them one interest test that measured career interests or one values test or one test on needs. I would give them 2 or 3 tests for each category because different tests, we're using different methodologies, asking different questions, should arrive at slightly different outcomes. And when you see the same outcome, pushing through in each of the different tests in a category, and in fact, when you start seeing a theme emerging across categories, the same theme emerges when we ask about your values, as does when we look at your needs, as does when we look at your style. That repetition, that overlap, is the surest way to get a high level of confidence that you've now identified something core about yourself. So data overlap, having lots of information is important, and it gives you that reassurance that you've identified core parts of your identity. So in a moment, we'll go into the first of these 5 elements, your values. But before we do that, I want to look and see if we have any other questions from the audience. And it looks like we do. So our next question, should lawyers keep business and personal relationships separate, or should they invest as much time as possible into personal? So when you're looking for a job, I strongly recommend that you rely on your personal network. Personal networks tend to be much more fruitful for most people than just relying on business networks alone, partly because it's a long-term relationship. It's not there just for the opportunism. It's there because you like the person and they like you, and they're much more likely to respond. Plus, they usually know you better and in a more personal way than the business relationships do. I find that if you rely just on business relationships, people can have a superficial and sometimes incorrect impression of what you like or what you're looking for. So yes, both are generally recommended. Number 3, is resilience an attribute or trait that is part of emotional intelligence? No, it's not part of emotional intelligence. It is both a trait and a learned skill. Every personality trait is to some extent genetic or dispositional, and to some extent learned. Most traits are far and away more genetic, more biologically predetermined, with a little bit of change possible through social learning. But resilience is an exception. Resilience has some biological predisposition. So you're born with a certain resilience level, and there's actually good research about what part of the brain regulates our resilience when we're born. But research clearly shows that a person can improve their resilience level no matter what you were born with. Some people luckily are born with very high resilience and they don't need to do much. But most of us start with a relatively low, most lawyers start with a relatively low resilience, and yet we can improve it dramatically. Emotional intelligence is a different set of qualities, and on May 13th, I'll be doing a webinar on emotional intelligence, so tune into that one if you're interested in what is emotional intelligence. The next question, without years of practice, how does a recent law grad know what area of law to specialize in? The fear is to get bottlenecked into an area because it's the only thing available. So that's a very good concern, and one of the things I suggest is by going through this process that I'm recommending today, you start understanding the criteria that matter to you. And once you have those criteria, it should give you a little bit of an easier time asking questions about a particular practice area. Will I get this need met, or will it match this set of values? The other thing that you can do is go to a psychologist and get a good personality test. Personality tests have to be administered by people trained in those tests, so I couldn't put one in my book. So you need to find somebody local that can give you good personality testing. And that personality test often gives you a lot of guidance about the kinds of practice areas that are likely to suit your personality. These are not hard and fast rules. There are always outliers that do well atypically in a particular practice area. But if you want to go with the flow, go with the majority, you're going to reduce some of the risk of making a mistake by looking at personality data. All right, so let's talk about values. The question with values is what's important to you. And there are a lot of different ways to find this out. One of the things that helps is to have some sort of a ranking exercise that presents you with lots of different values and forces you, in effect, to put into a hierarchy the values that matter to you. And there are two exercises I'm going to talk about today that will help you do that. Both are in my book. The first one is what we'll call the Career Anchors model. This is developed at MIT by a psychologist named Edgar Schein, S-C-H-E-I-N. And Schein was hired many years ago, probably 30 years ago, by IBM to help them with a project identifying how to find people who were true blue employees. And what he discovered is that there were certain values that drove career decisions of people. It was quite an accidental discovery. And he basically boiled it down to 8 different values. So I'm going to list them first and then walk through what each of them is. Security, autonomy, entrepreneurial, general manager, these are Schein's labels, craft, or what he called technical functional competence, principle, pure challenge, and lifestyle. Each of these is a come from, something that a person values, and it rises above the others when they think about, is this job for me? What keeps me in this job? And you need to know which anchor is your driver. What's the value that matters most to you? So let's take a look at each of these. The security anchor is basically when somebody has a need for security and predictability and certainty. There's been some debate about this one because most psychologists would consider security to be more of a psychological need. But Schein makes a good point that there is also a values aspect to security, what matters to you, as opposed to what do you feel you must have. And security can come from 2 different sources. You can have geographical security, that's the less common of the 2, where you basically say, I like living in New York. It's my kind of town. I don't really want a job anywhere else because I feel more alive when I'm in this location. And so that has to be my first criteria for a job. More common is tenured security. I feel like I've got tenure as a professor, or I've got a civil service position in the government, or I work for a large corporation that has a very established policy of seniority. Those kinds of jobs are getting fewer and far between today in today's rapidly changing world, but there are still jobs like that available, and if this is your anchor, you probably want a job like that. The military is another area where tenured security is available. The second anchor is autonomy, and what's meant by autonomy here is not being controlled by other people. It doesn't mean you control them, it just means I'm free to call my own shots. And you may think initially that means being on your own, but there are a number of jobs where you don't have to be on your own to have autonomy. You could work in a big corporation and have a lot of latitude. In fact, working in a law firm, in most cases, lawyers, because we're professionals, we are given a lot of latitude. And so most lawyers have a lot of autonomy to practice law as they see fit. They may not have autonomy with things like when they have to show up for work, or the way they have to put together a memorandum, or the type of stationery they have to use. There might be some constraint about autonomy on those peripheral aspects of the practice. But the core of I can practice the way I want to, for a high autonomy person, that matters. For really high autonomy people, even things like whether I have to use the firm's stationery might bother you, and you might find you need to be on your own. But autonomy is a very common career anchor for lawyers. Entrepreneurial is an anchor that says, I want to build something. I want to build something particularly that's creative. And I'm happy to hand it off to other people to run it once I build it. But I like that experience of generativity, of creativity. So in the law, that might be somebody who is an IP lawyer, for example, and likes to work on the strategic use of IP as a strategy tool. And it can be a very entrepreneurial thing. Doing real estate syndications or doing corporate deals is another area where we often see people with this anchor go into law. A lot of people with this anchor go into business, but in the law you can get this met. General manager. This is very rare for lawyers. It's most people with this anchor like the traditional business world. What general manager anchors like is climbing a hierarchical ladder and making tough decisions, especially the kinds of decisions where no matter what you do, it's going to have a downside. And the general manager types love those no-win decisions. Somebody's got to make them, and I'm up to the job. So if you like managing people and managing capital and managing inventory and managing information and making tough decisions, this is the anchor for you, and it may lead you into a more commercial business type position out of law. There are some people in law departments of companies that play a hybrid role where they're both lawyers and VPs in the company, and they get to sit in on business decisions, so that sometimes meets the needs of this person. Craft or technical functional competence. This is probably the most popular one for lawyers because everybody wishes that they had this anchor. When you have this anchor, there's a particular skill or a craft or a competency that you know that is something you're good at, and you want to get even better at it, and you love using it. So my dad knew from age 7 he wanted to be a lawyer. He never wavered. He never thought of anything else, and he became a great lawyer. And he knew early on. I don't know why he did. I don't know what made him want that. We never figured it out. But it was clear that that was what he wanted, and that's what he did. Years ago, one of my career clients was practicing law, didn't really like it, and he said, who I am as a writer. He knew that was his identity. And over the course of our counseling, he migrated from law into a writing job. And it was very clear to him that that's who he is. If this is your anchor, you already know what the skill is. if you hear this and go, oh, that's it, I want to have a career anchor. Let me just figure out what my skill is. This is probably not your anchor. Because this applies mainly to people who already have something that really turns them on. They know what it is. They just haven't spent time figuring out how to make it front. Principle. If this is your anchor, there's some principle that drives you. Let's say that what matters to you is the environment. And you want to make sure that whatever you do, your job furthers your principle. And that you're principle driven. So people with this principle need to work in a job, first and foremost, that furthers that principle. Number 7 is pure challenge. These are people who love winning, who love constantly achieving, especially short-term wins. They like competition. So it might be working for a competitive business or a competitive practice. A lot of trial lawyers like this, where they take the impossible case and win it. I had somebody that did a lot of very risky real estate deals, and she absolutely loved the challenge of doing those deals. They were big and complex and lots of risk of it not working, and when they worked, she loved it. The last one is lifestyle. Basically, this is a qualitatively different anchor from all of the others that basically says when you work is just a means to get money or freedom of time so that you can do the things you really like, which is time to do hobbies or to have relationships or be with family. So that's a lifestyle anchor. Think about this. If you find that there are more than one that appeal to you, you could get Ed Schein's book called Career Anchors. You could juxtapose your 2 most attractive anchors and see which one would you give up. The one you give up last is likely to be the career anchor. The other values mechanism is a card sort. I have an example of a card sort that you can actually cut out in the back of the book. Or you can find these card sorts online all over the place. Each value is listed on a card, and in a typical card sort there are about 48, 50 different values. And what you do is create 5 columns from always valued to never valued, and you sort them based on what matters to you most. What I recommend is that the first column, limit yourself to 8, so you force yourself to look at the most important values. Keep track, take a snapshot with your phone of the values once you've sorted them, and then put it away for 3 weeks. Don't look at it. Then 3 weeks later, get the cards out and sort them again without any reference to what you did earlier. You want this to be an independent card sorting exercise on round 2. And then take a snapshot of the tableau, put it away, and do it a 3rd time 3 weeks later. Now compare notes. What you will find is that the top 8 are not always the identical ones or in the identical order. And what you want to do is analyze what values stayed in the top 8 through all 3 card sorts. That's very, very informative. Next, we'll take a look at psychological needs, and before we do that, let's see if there are some questions here. Why don't they just hire and train according to their needs, basing on the personality? Good question. Some firms do. There are a lot of myths and misunderstandings about personality, and because lawyers are risk averse, there's been traditionally a lot of resistance to using personality. But that resistance is beginning to fall by the wayside as more and more firms are starting to use personality assessments, not to screen out people so much as to help candidates assess, is this a good fit? Am I entering a job, a firm, a position that's, who I am? The better the fit, the more and the individual will be. Why should they be playing with the game of and interviews? I'm not sure what that question means. So we'll come back to it. How do we reconcile having more than one anchor? The answer is that usually requires someone to coach you. You might find self-help, as I mentioned in Ed Schein's book, but we don't have time to go into the details today. Can your anchor value change over time? Values can change over time, but they're very glacial. They're very slow to change. unless somebody has a very atypical, uncommon, life-changing event, which is rare. So psychological needs, basically where values are analog, you can have more or less of them, needs are digital. Let's say you have a need to be included. Some people like being included, others are very independent. Or you have a need for control, or a need to be very open or very closed and private. You need to know that you have this need so that you get it met in the workplace. And once it's met, like I said earlier, it kind of goes away. You don't think about it. The reason it's important if you're changing jobs is you might have one of your needs met right now and totally not be aware of it because it's met. When it's met, it's out of awareness. If you go to a new job and you haven't thoughtfully considered what are my needs, what are the ones especially that I'm not even thinking about, in that next job you may fail to meet that need because you didn't consciously take it into consideration. So take a look at needs. Usually this is assessed through testing. Third is communication style. And there are a lot of models for this. I like to use the Myers-Briggs as a model for communication style. This basically helps us understand the kinds of environments and the kinds of people we like hanging around with, how we make decisions, how we deal with people. So the MBTI, many of you have taken it. If not, most law schools can administer the MBTI. Career counselors, psychologists, they can all administer it. There are 4 scales. Are you extroverted or introverted? Where do you get your energy? Sensing intuition is about how you gather data. Sensing types prefer details and specific concrete information. Intuitives are big picture. Thinking and feeling are how you make decisions. Do you use logic and detached objectivity? That's what thinkers do. Or do you use personal values like feelers? And judging perceiving is about how you organize the first 3. Judges are methodical, orderly, structured. They plan. Perceivers play things by ear. They like to hang fast and loose. They don't like to be boxed into a corner. Getting feedback about the Myers-Briggs is a very useful way to understand your communication style. So next, let's take a look at motivated skills. What do you do well and like doing? There's a card sort that you can use, and you can obtain a copy of these slides from ABA. So you can go to Career Trainer and cut out the cards and sort them yourself to see what skills you really like using. You can also take the Gallup Strengths Finder at the website that's on the screen. Gallup is a very well-researched tool. It's been taken by over 11 million people worldwide, and it can give you a hierarchical ranking of the strengths, which basically are the skills that you like using. And finally, career interest. Like I said, this is the most transitory category. It changes over time. Be careful, lots of self-help books make this front and center. That same website, you can download the interest card sort or my book or Bowles, What Color is Your Parachute? B-O-L-L-E-S. Now let's look at job criteria. So what you want to do after you've gone through the process, and this process can take several weeks for somebody to go through each of these 5 categories, gather multiple sets of data for each of the components of your career identity, and then look at the repeating items. And based on those repeating items, especially the ones that repeated that you love doing, and you might also track what repeated over and over that you absolutely never want to be exposed to. That can enable you to have a list of the must-haves and the must-avoids. Those are the first 2 categories you want to make lists of first. Icing on the cake is this middle category. What would I like if I had my druthers? The main thing here is you want to separate out, you want to make sure you don't confuse what I'd like and what I must have. A lot of people in planning their careers confuse those 2. And this more disciplined process that I'm walking you through is designed to separate out the difference between would likes and must-haves. The must-haves will emerge very clearly from the exercise with the 5 categories. So back to our model, we've talked about the components of career identity, and we're now going to talk about a little bit about these environments and conditions. There are 3 kinds of jobs that a lawyer can do. You can go into another job as a lawyer, maybe changing the size of the firm that you work with, or the culture of the law firm that you work with, or a little harder is the practice area that you work in, or the geographical location. There are lots of transitions you can make within law and still not give up the practice of law. Some people find that the nature of law practice itself is not suitable for them, but they don't want to waste all of the training that they've had, either understanding the law, which might be good, for example, in a job where you're doing editing of legal publications, or an understanding of the profession, how do lawyers work, the business of law. That might be useful in some consulting jobs. So law-related jobs are jobs that capitalize on the knowledge you've gained practicing law in either of those ways, either substantively or in terms of the context of law. Non-law jobs don't usually require training as a lawyer, but often the skills of lawyering can be very useful in transitioning to a non-law job. So when you sit down and say, what are the skills that I've acquired as a lawyer? Critical thinking is probably high on the list. The ability to analyze dispassionately, the ability to argue persuasively, the ability to write cogently. These are typically the skills that you will see, and many of those skills can be used to pivot to non-law jobs. Question, is there a way to contact you for personalized career counseling? And I should have mentioned at the outset, while I did counseling for many years, I no longer do career counseling. There are plenty of excellent career counselors that do that type of work, and Legal Career Central at the American Bar Association is probably a good starting point. You might want to contact some of the folks at Legal Career Central. Many of the folks whose names you see there have active career counseling practices for lawyers. All right, next. So we've talked about that. So when you make a transition to the transition time is longest for non-law. Making a transition within the legal profession generally is the shortest. Now, it depends on your geographical location, your level of experience, the practice that you're in. I can't make any real generalizations about how long it takes. I mean, I've seen people who make a transition in a month, and I've seen people that take well over a year to make the same kind of transition because they have different levels of attractiveness to future employers. But generally, as a general rule, changing within the legal profession is easiest. Changing to a law-related job, depending on the kind of job, can be almost as easy. But the hardest transition and the longest one is getting out of law and changing to a non-law job. You really have to repackage yourself. And the way that you do that I recommend is to think about the continuity of the skills that you used. In other words, you're not going to emphasize, I was a lawyer and now I want to become X. What you want to emphasize is, I spent my whole career writing and now I want to, turn that writing skill from the legal world to this world. You're basically reframing your identity as a writer, or reframing your identity as an oral advocate, or reframing your identity as a problem solver. You want to show continuity of that skill and basically shift the emphasis from a lawyer who happened to have that skill to a person with that skill who happened to be practicing law. That's the mindset shift that helps in repackaging yourself. Think of the repackaging as involving a series of steps. I like to liken it to the process of a sailboat tacking in the wind. The sailboat wants to go from point A to point B, but it doesn't go directly. It goes a little to the left, and then it shifts and tacks to the right, and then it goes to the left again and the right, each time catching a bit of the wind. Transitions to non-law jobs work this way because you often have to go to a job you might not really want in the long term just because it has some feature that allows you to transition more towards the kind of work you want to do. It might allow you to use that skill that you like using, but not have other aspects that you want, but it allows you to tell the next employer, look how much I'm using this skill in job number 2. Let me say a word about networking. When an employer advertises a job, they basically have to artificially set criteria for that job. So for example, you'll often see ads that say, must have at least 5 years of experience. Why 5 years? Why not 4 years or 6 years? There's no good answer. They had to have some number to put in the ad. And so they arbitrarily say 5 because they think, well, somebody who's had at least that experience, they've been in it long enough to know that it's the right field for them, and they've been tested, and so forth. But it's entirely possible that you with 3 years of amazing experience who loves what you're trying to get into would be better than a lackadaisical person with 5 years experience. So these are arbitrary criteria, and that's why jobs that already are posted, by definition, are very, very unlikely to match your 5 components of your career criteria. A much better way to find a fit is figure out what your criteria are and then start looking for what does that set of criteria sound like to you as a job. I used to tell my clients, cut out ads, not because you want those jobs, but because you can then ask yourself, what is it about that ad that appeals to me? And if you do that with 5 or 6 or 7 ads, and you write for each one, why does this job appeal to me? You'll start seeing some recurring themes, and that will help you start saying, this is the kind of job that I want to start looking for. You generally at this stage don't want a particular job title. You just want a general idea. I'll be helping people solve problems in an intellectual environment, or I will be working with people in a way that blah, blah, blah. Then you can start telling your friends mainly what you're looking for with the key criteria that you've identified from the search process. And that helps to clarify for them, because it's something that you at that point should be passionate about. Your friends will recognize it and it'll be easier for them to remember it than if you give them a job title. The last thing I want to say about that is it is helpful in the networking process to pick a particular job if you can narrow down to one, even if you're open to many other possible jobs beside that one, because specificity is memorable. And people don't, for the most part, if you say, I want to be a teacher, they won't say, oh, well, you said teacher, you didn't say this, that, or the other thing. If they see a job that kind of sounds like it but isn't quite the same, most people will say, hey, I know you said teacher, but what do you think about this? In other words, being specific lets them remember what you're looking for, but at the same time, you're more likely to have people pay attention to other possibilities for you. By contrast, if you tell people, I want to do A or B or C or D, no one is going to remember that over time. Let's go back to the questions. The next question is that the same as transitioning into a legal career? An excellent question. I don't know enough about the questioner's question to really answer that. But the principles that I've been discussing of identifying your core career identity criteria certainly apply. You want to know before you go into a legal career what aspects of your personal identity will be fulfilled when you make that transition. So Tracy, I'm going to turn it back to you for any closing comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richard, and thank you all for attending today's webinar. Be sure to join us for next month's webinar, Lawyer Resilience and Grit, also with Dr. Richard. Attendees will receive a recording of today's webinar and a follow-up email early next week. Also, if you have a moment, please take time to complete our short post-webinar survey. Thanks and have a great day.